F-117 somewhere outside Baghdad. In a dimly lit radar station, two Soviet advisors stood over an Iraqi operator's shoulder, eyes locked on a green-lit screen. Static pulsed, the usual hum of atmospheric noise. The sky was supposed to be clear. No movement, no signatures. Suddenly, a shockwave rattled the bunker. Far off, a fireball mushroomed over a command center that wasn't just protected, it was embedded inside one of Iraq's most heavily defended sectors. Panic crackled through headsets. Sirens wailed. Operators shouted. But the radar still showed nothing. Then it happened again. Another explosion. Different sector. Same result. No blip. No warning. Just a flash of light and another building erased from the map. Within 5 minutes, 3 hardened bunkers were destroyed. Within 20, more than a dozen critical sites, air defense hubs, communication relays, command shelters had been turned to rubble. And yet, every screen in the bunker still glowed with meaningless static. No aircraft, no approach, no escape vector. The radar had seen none of them. The advisors whispered something in Russian. One stepped away, muttering the words, "It's not possible." But it was. What the Soviets had spent 4 decades perfecting, an airtight umbrella of radar detection and missile defense, was being dismantled in real time by a weapon they couldn't see, couldn't stop, and barely believed existed. Outside, the desert sky was calm. No dogfights, no missile trails, no audible jets. Just the hum of cooling metal and the glow of fires where radar posts used to be. They weren't being jammed. They weren't being outgunned. They were being erased. What the Soviets had long dismissed as science fiction had just rewritten the rules of war. And in that moment, inside that Baghdad bunker, the terrifying realization dawned. The radar era was over. In the early hours after the first strikes, Soviet advisors inside Iraq's integrated air defense network were still reeling. At first, they suspected power failures, then sabotage, maybe electronic warfare. But when technicians confirmed full system integrity, no jamming, no data loss, no blackouts, the horror began to settle in. The enemy hadn't hacked the system. They'd walked through it. For decades, Soviet doctrine was built on one premise: radar sees all. From the early P-8 knife rest systems of the 1,950 seconds to the advanced P-18 spoon rest D and the SNR-75 tracking radars deployed in the 1,980 seconds, each generation had extended range, refined resolution, and narrowed blind spots, layered coverage, redundancy, early warning, all of it designed to ensure that nothing with wings crossed into protected airspace unseen. And yet, something had. American stealth technology had always been a theory acknowledged, but dismissed. Soviet engineers knew about radar cross-sections, about faceted shaping and radar-absorbent materials. They even ran wind tunnel tests of strange-looking models, attempting to reverse engineer the angles. But the belief remained unchanged. Stealth was possible, but not practical. It required fragile coatings, compromised aerodynamics, and reduced payloads. It wasn't fit for war, only for labs and prototypes. That belief died over Baghdad. Inside briefing rooms back in Moscow, senior radar officers reviewed tapes from Iraqi radar logs. There were no missed tracks, no evidence of spoofed signatures, no anomalies at all, just clean sweeps and empty skies. One colonel put it bluntly: "We built a fortress. They built a ghost." The Soviets had assumed that radar dominance meant air dominance, that if a target could be seen, it could be killed, and if it couldn't be seen, it didn't exist. But now, phone 117 seconds were not only unseen, they were delivering bombs with pinpoint accuracy and leaving without a trace. The error wasn't just technical, it was ideological. Radar had become not just a tool, but a belief system, one that dictated how wars would be fought, how defense budgets were spent, how alliances were structured. Radar coverage zones were drawn like national borders. Interception timelines were drilled like doctrine. The entire Soviet warfighting machine had been engineered around the principle that nothing could hide from its eyes, until something did. And not just one thing, but an entire wing of aircraft designed, built, and deployed in complete darkness. The room of wrong assumptions wasn't in Baghdad. It was in Moscow, and its walls were beginning to crack. For the Soviet Union, air defense was never an afterthought. It was an obsession, an industrial-scale enterprise built from the trauma of World War II. The devastation of German bombing raids had taught one brutal lesson: the air must be controlled, or the ground would burn. By the 1,980 seconds, the Soviet air defense doctrine was the most elaborate in the world. It combined 3 tiers of protection: early warning radars, surface-to-air missile batteries, and interceptor squadrons. Cities were ringed with radar sites. Borders were lined with overlapping surveillance zones. Mobile units could be deployed to seal any breach. The entire system was based on one principle: if it flies, we see it. If we see it, we kill it. That doctrine had been tested, and it had worked. From the shootdown of Francis Gary Powers' U-2 inches 1,960 to the rapid engagement of border violations in Eastern Europe, Soviet systems had proven lethal. They weren't elegant. They weren't subtle. But they were overwhelming. So, when the first reports arrived from Baghdad that dozens of critical radar sites had been destroyed without detection, Soviet planners assumed the Iraqis had made mistakes. Human error, equipment failure, training gaps. But that assumption began to unravel within hours. The Iraqis had followed Soviet air defense doctrine to the letter. Their radar grid was designed by Soviet engineers. Their missile crews were trained by Soviet officers. Their intercept tactics had been practiced for years. They did everything right, and it still wasn't enough. Phone 117 seconds had glided through the network like water through a sieve. The bombers had struck high-value targets, radar installations, communication bunkers, airfields without triggering a single radar alert. No target tracking, no missile locks, no scramble orders. The shock wasn't just that Soviet systems had failed. It was that they'd failed exactly as designed. The doctrine had no defense against absence. It was built to intercept speed, altitude, and direction. It could counter high, fast bombers. It could respond to saturation raids. But it couldn't comprehend an enemy that didn't appear on screens. Inside the Soviet General Staff, crisis meetings began. Advisors argued for electronic countermeasures. Others suggested radar upgrades. But the reality was inescapable. No radar system could detect what no radar signature revealed. It wasn't a matter of improving the doctrine. It was a matter of abandoning it. The Soviet Air Defense Forces, once the pride of the military-industrial complex, were now defenders of a doctrine that no longer matched the battlefield. And worse, every upgrade, every iteration, every billion rubles spent had only reinforced the wrong assumptions. They had prepared for waves of bombers. Instead, they got ghosts. The 17th of January 1991. Just after midnight, in the skies above Baghdad, a formation of 8 aircraft approached silently at high altitude, on a direct path to the heart of Iraq's air defense network. No escort, no jamming, no radio traffic. The only sound was the soft whisper of air folding over angular wings designed for one purpose: to disappear. The aircraft were F-117 Nighthawks, America's first operational stealth bombers. Their mission: destroy Iraq's central radar control hubs before a single alarm could be triggered. If they failed, the entire coalition air campaign would be flying into a hornet's nest of Soviet-designed missile systems and anti-air artillery. But they didn't fail. In fact, the first target, a key radar node near Al-Taji, exploded before the local operators even realized anything was inbound. The radar never lit up, no alarm sounded. The building simply vanished in a column of fire. 4 minutes later, The next strike hit a hardened command bunker near Baghdad International Airport. Again, no warning. No missile launch. No radar track. Just silence and then destruction. By the time the sun rose, over a dozen precision strikes had crippled Iraq's radar infrastructure. All from aircraft that were never seen, never locked, never even acknowledged until after the fact. Soviet advisors embedded in Baghdad's Air Defense Command watched the chaos unfold with grim disbelief. They'd trained these crews. They'd built these systems. They knew exactly how many radars were online, how many missiles were loaded, how many fighters were on standby. And yet, none of it mattered. The Iraqis weren't overwhelmed. They were bypassed. The phone, 117 seconds, flew straight through the center of the air defense grid. Not low and fast like traditional strike aircraft, but high and invisible. No terrain masking. No decoys. Just a direct approach and surgical precision. This was not an error in Iraqi execution. This was the first undeniable proof that Soviet air defense technology had met something it couldn't counter. The implications were staggering. These aircraft hadn't just evaded detection. They had destroyed the very systems designed to find them, before those systems ever turned on. It wasn't just that the enemy had attacked first. It was that they'd attacked before the war even started. In the days that followed, radar crews in Baghdad operated on pure instinct. When they fired blind. When they launched late. And in every case, they were targeting shadows. The phone 117 seconds never returned fire, never dogfought, never loitered. They came, they struck, they vanished. And the first impossible event, the complete destruction of a radar network by aircraft it never saw, had just rewritten what was possible in modern warfare. In the cold conference halls of Moscow's General Staff headquarters, disbelief reigned. Reports streamed in from GRU assets and diplomatic backchannels. Iraqi radar posts had been destroyed. Command bunkers struck with surgical accuracy. Surface-to-air missile batteries failed to engage. Hundreds of Soviet-designed systems were rendered useless in the opening hours of the war. But what chilled Soviet commanders wasn't the destruction itself. It was the complete lack of detection. No radar returns. No electronic signatures. No thermal anomalies. Just targets struck and screens that stayed blank. The official reports from Baghdad were almost laughed out of the room. Soviet air defense commanders refused to accept that aircraft could simply pass through layered radar coverage without triggering a single alert. A three-star general dismissed it flatly. Either they are lying, or we trained ghosts. But the truth kept closing in. Soviet-made radars had been destroyed while active. SAM systems had gone offline before launch. Even early warning aircraft had failed to pick up any trace. Worse, surviving Iraqi units were firing wildly, firing blind into the night sky, wasting ammunition and exposing positions for follow-up strikes. Internal debate turned bitter. One camp insisted the Americans had developed advanced jamming systems. Perhaps they were flooding Soviet radars with false returns or using electronic deception to mask their approach. But signals intelligence from Syria and Jordan told a different story. There were no bursts, no distortions. The radars weren't being tricked. They were being ignored. Another theory proposed that the aircraft were flying low, under the radar horizon. But again, battle damage assessments proved otherwise. Bombs had been delivered from medium altitudes, with laser-like accuracy, often onto rooftops and buried bunkers. These weren't low-level intrusions. These were high-altitude assassinations. Finally, a classified intercept from an Iraqi officer shattered the last thread of denial. It read simply, "They are not jamming us. We cannot see them." This wasn't just a tactical surprise. It was a strategic upheaval. Stealth had not been a bluff. It had not been delayed in production. It had not been too fragile for war. It was operational. It was precise. And it had rendered Soviet air defense doctrine obsolete overnight. Still, the most powerful denial came not from the evidence, but from pride. For decades, Soviet military planners had invested in a layered air defense that was believed to be unmatched. It had become a symbol of strategic depth, a psychological shield as much as a military one. Now that shield was transparent. And Moscow, the city that once believed it could never be surprised from the sky, was watching helplessly, as Baghdad proved otherwise. In the wake of the first night's chaos, Soviet defense analysts clung to the most logical explanation they had: electronic warfare. Not stealth, not invisibility, but deception pure and simple. The theory was elegant and dangerously wrong. They proposed that the phone 117 seconds had employed new forms of electronic jamming so advanced they didn't just confuse Iraqi radar, they made the jets seem absent entirely. After all, jamming was a known tool, one the Soviets themselves had pioneered. High-powered noise generators, false returns, Doppler modulation. Surely the Americans had simply taken these concepts and pushed them to a new level. Briefings across the Warsaw Pact adopted this line. Phone 117 seconds were dismissed as EW platforms with bombs. Soviet engineers were told to focus not on redesigning radar fundamentals, but on reinforcing existing anti-jamming protocols. But there was one problem. There was no jamming. Signals intelligence units monitoring the frequency spectrum over Iraq reported nothing. No spikes, no broadband saturation, no spoofing techniques. The electronic spectrum was eerily clean, so clean in fact that many operators assumed their gear was malfunctioning, but it wasn't. What Soviet analysts failed to understand was that the F-117 didn't overpower radar, it dodged it entirely. Its shape was engineered not to reflect radar energy, but to deflect it away from the source. Every edge, every angle, every seam had been sculpted to absorb or redirect electromagnetic waves. Its coating, a composite blend of radar-absorbent material, reduced its cross-section to that of a bird. Its engine intakes were buried. Its exhaust, masked. Its surfaces jagged and faceted to scatter signals instead of bouncing them back. The F-117 didn't show up on radar screens because there was nothing to detect. But in Soviet war rooms, this explanation was considered implausible. Absurd, even. They reasoned that stealth couldn't be practical because it sacrificed too much payload, speed, maneuverability. No one would field a plane so specialized, so delicate, for frontline combat. But that's exactly what the Americans had done. While Soviet air doctrine was designed for mass engagements and brute force waves of MiGs, batteries of SAMs, fields of fire, the U.S. had pursued subtraction. One plane, one target, one strike. It wasn't about flying faster. It was about flying quieter, not lower. By the time Soviet advisors realized their mistake, dozens of high-value targets had already been erased. Radars, bunkers, airfields, each taken down with precision bombs from aircraft their doctrine said shouldn't exist, and still, Moscow clung to the wrong theory. Because to accept the truth that radar supremacy had been permanently broken was to accept the death of their greatest military certainty. As it became increasingly difficult to deny the failures of Soviet radar systems, a second theory took hold within Moscow's defense establishment. If it wasn't jamming, then perhaps it was a trick of speed and flight pattern, something more traditional, something survivable. They called it maneuver-based invisibility. The concept argued that the phone 117 seconds weren't truly invisible, but rather exploiting gaps in radar coverage. Every radar system, no matter how advanced, has blind spots between overlapping cones of detection, behind terrain, below the radar horizon. If the Americans had mapped these voids meticulously and timed their strikes to thread the needle through them, then their attacks might appear stealthy, without any real invisibility. This theory was less fanciful than electronic deception, and it offered a hopeful angle. Patch the holes, extend the coverage, increase cross-sector coordination. In theory, the radar net could be tightened, but again, it was wrong. Phone 117 seconds hadn't flown erratically or evasively. They hadn't hugged valleys or slalomed through dead zones. In fact, their flight paths were shockingly direct, high altitude, minimal course correction, and without electronic countermeasures. Satellite data and intercepted mission logs made this clear. The stealth bombers weren't dodging radar. They were facing it head-on and not being seen. The Soviet second theory crumbled under a single question posed by an Air Defense Forces colonel. If it were just gaps, why didn't any radar pick them up before or after the strike? The truth was brutal. Stealth wasn't about clever flying. It was about becoming the hole in the sky. The F-117 wasn't slipping through radar seams. It was making the seams irrelevant. Its radar cross-section was so minuscule that even overlapping radar beams couldn't catch it. Every wavelength passed over and around it like wind through reeds. And unlike traditional aircraft, it didn't announce its presence with afterburners or contrails or radio emissions. It simply existed in silence. The second wrong theory was appealing because it meant the problem could be fixed with hardware and math. Add more radars. Reposition arrays. Link command sectors with faster networks. But what the Soviet analysts refused to accept was this. They weren't facing a navigational trick. They were facing a different category of aircraft, one designed from the ground up to break the assumptions radar was built on. The strategic miscalculation was enormous. While Soviet engineers had invested in taller radar towers and faster interceptors, the Americans had poured everything into disappearing altogether. Not maneuverability, not firepower, not dogfighting, just non-existence on a screen. The belief that better geometry or faster coordination could outpace stealth was comforting. But it wasn't true. And in war, false comfort is fatal. The signs had been there, long before Baghdad's skies went dark, long before radar stations vanished under precise detonations, and long before Soviet engineers found themselves staring at blank screens. The warnings had echoed across the global intelligence community, but in Moscow, they were ignored. Throughout the late 1,970 seconds and 1,980 seconds, fragmentary reports trickled in from GRU operatives, satellite imagery, and even stolen trade conference materials. Strange triangular aircraft shapes spotted at Groom Lake, anomalous infrared signatures that didn't match known engine profiles, mysterious procurement orders for radar-absorbent materials, none of which matched conventional aircraft lines. One intercepted American logistics chain showed large quantities of carbon composites being routed to a classified black program in Nevada. Another detailed the hiring of radar scientists from obscure institutions into Lockheed's Skunk Works division. Still, Soviet intelligence dismissed it all. The KGB's Directorate T, the office responsible for technical and scientific espionage, considered stealth a distraction tactic. Their analysts believed the Americans were planting disinformation, exaggerating their capabilities to draw Soviet resources into dead-end counterprojects. They weren't wrong about American intent. They were wrong about the outcome. In reality, the U.S. wasn't bluffing. It was hiding in plain sight. Black projects like Have Blue and Senior Trend had successfully produced prototype stealth aircraft by 1981. By 1983, the first phone 117 seconds were operational, and by 1989, a full wing was combat-ready, trained, tested, and lethal. But none of it registered on Soviet radar. Literally and metaphorically, their entire signals, intelligence infrastructure designed to catch transmissions, emissions, and radar profiles was blind to a system engineered to avoid all three. Even human assets placed within defense contractors brought back nothing. The F-117's program was compartmentalized to an extreme degree, with engineers working on isolated components, unaware of the final product. When GRU analysts finally pieced together an image of the phone 117 inches late, 1,989, it looked so alien that some dismissed it as science fiction. No vertical stabilizers, no curved surfaces, a shape that made no sense aerodynamically unless one understood that it had been optimized not for flight, but for disappearance. The real intelligence failure wasn't just about missed reports. It was about institutional disbelief. Soviet doctrine was built around a core certainty. Nothing moves in the sky without detection. Even if America had developed something stealthy, Soviet thinkers believed it would be too compromised in other areas, to matter too slow, too fragile, too light on weapons. They didn't consider that America might build an aircraft that sacrificed everything for one goal: first strike supremacy against air defense systems. And so, when that strike finally came silent, invisible, and devastating the KGB, the GRU, and Soviet air defense planners were all caught facing the same reality. They had failed to see what had been flying over them for years. To the outside world, the F-117 Nighthawk seemed like a miracle of engineering, a jet that defied detection, a ghost in the air, a weapon born of science fiction. But to those who built it, flew it, and deployed it, the truth was even more terrifying. The F-117 was not a miracle. It was a system. It began not in the skies, but on the drawing boards of Lockheed's Skunk Works, where engineers like Ben Rich and his team redefined what aircraft design even meant. No longer was flight performance king. Instead, radar cross-section RCS became the prime directive. Every line, edge, and panel of the F-117 was mathematically shaped to bend electromagnetic waves away from their source. The plane was not built to fly beautifully, it was built to fly invisible, and that was just the surface. The real strength of the American stealth program lay not in a single jet, but in a networked doctrine of precision warfare that the Soviets had no answer for. At its core was target prioritization. U.S. war planners used satellite data, electronic intelligence, and real-time battlefield surveillance to construct kill chains, logical maps of which targets needed to fall first, and in what order, to unravel an enemy's defense. With this data, the F-117 didn't just strike randomly, it surgically dismantled the architecture of resistance. Then came navigation. The F-117 flew missions at night, guided not by pilot eyesight but by a sophisticated inertial navigation system paired with GPS and digital terrain matching. This allowed the Nighthawk to fly pinpoint routes at medium altitude, striking targets within meters of accuracy, even in total darkness. Its payload? Only 2 bombs. But these were laser-guided, computer-targeted munitions capable of destroying hardened bunkers, radar arrays, or command nodes in a single strike. No need for carpet bombing. No need for mass formations. One plane. One target. One destruction. The pilot sat alone, behind angled glass, reading off mission data fed through encrypted links. There was no gun, no radar, no radio chatter, just cold focus and total silence. Supporting this ghost aircraft was an ecosystem of American dominance. Airborne command centers, AWACS aircraft scanning the theater, jamming platforms like the F-111, Ravens suppressing known threats, and satellite systems relaying battlefield telemetry. It wasn't just stealth, it was stealth embedded inside a digitally coordinated, real-time battlefield nervous system. To the Soviets, war had always been about mass formations, mass fires, mass armor. But the F-117 represented a new American vision. War by precision, not attrition. Instead of 100 aircraft flying into a hail of missiles, the U.S. could send 10, none of which were seen, and eliminate 100 targets. This was the true revolution. The F-117 didn't break Soviet air defenses because it was unbeatable in a dogfight or impervious to missiles. It broke them because it skipped the entire engagement. It never showed up on scopes. It never gave warning. And by the time explosions rang out, it was already gone. The Americans hadn't just changed how planes were made. They had changed what planes meant. It was one thing to lose. It was another to not even know the war had started. For Soviet advisors embedded in Baghdad, the Gulf War was supposed to be the ultimate test of their doctrine, a showcase of layered air defense, precision-guided SAMs, and deep intercept radar. Instead, it became a masterclass in irrelevance. The opening night of Operation Desert Storm rewrote every rule. Phone 117 seconds led the attack, not trailing behind jammers and fighter sweeps like traditional bombers. They flew into the teeth of Iraq's Soviet-trained defenses alone, unaided and unstoppable. In under an hour, dozens of key nodes in the integrated air defense system were gone. Communications hubs, early warning radars, central command bunkers. Each bomb found its mark. Each strike shattered a connection, and none of the jets were seen. Soviet-made SA-2 seconds, SA-3 seconds, and SA-6 seconds, the pride of Eastern Bloc missile design, stood useless. SAM crews watched their launch systems vaporize before they could activate. Dozens of radar sites reported no incoming aircraft. Dozens more fell silent forever. By dawn, 80% of Iraq's air defense was either destroyed or in disarray. And still, the Iraqis and their Soviet advisors hadn't seen the planes responsible. The psychological damage was even greater than the physical. In Soviet doctrine, control of the air was achieved through engagement. But here, engagement was denied entirely. There was no contest, no scramble, no radar lock, no fight. Just absence. One Soviet colonel reportedly stared at an obliterated radar console and muttered, "We didn't lose this battle. We weren't even invited." The humiliation echoed beyond Baghdad. Warsaw Pact allies reeled in disbelief as the scale of the disaster became clear. Satellite photos showed burned-out radar arrays and twisted metal where hardened sites had once stood. The Americans weren't just penetrating Soviet-built defenses, they were rendering them obsolete in hours. Worst of all, the Iraqis had followed the manual. They had deployed systems as trained, coordinated radar coverage as instructed, and responded as per Soviet advisories. And yet, the phone 117 seconds had danced through the network unchallenged, erased critical nodes, and vanished. This was not a fluke. It was not luck. It was the future of air power. For Soviet strategists, the battle represented more than a defeat. It shattered confidence in one of the USSR's crown jewels, its promise of air defense supremacy. And the entire world had watched. On CNN, grainy footage showed precision bombs hitting targets with eerie accuracy. Western commentators spoke of surgical strikes and ghost jets. In Kremlin halls, the mood turned grim. If the U.S. could destroy a hardened, Soviet-designed IADS in 48 hours without a single airframe lost, what could they do to Warsaw? Or Moscow? The humiliation wasn't just tactical. It was existential. In war, there is nothing worse than realizing the battlefield no longer belongs to you. In the weeks following Desert Storm, what shook Soviet leadership wasn't just the defeat of Iraq's air defenses, it was the strategic implications that followed. The Gulf War had become an open-air laboratory where American technology annihilated Soviet doctrine in full view of the world. And nowhere was that collapse more visible than in the performance of the F-117. For decades, Soviet ideology had been rooted in a belief that massed defenses, layered SAM systems, overlapping radar coverage, integrated command structures could halt any aerial assault. These systems had been exported, drilled, and fine-tuned across client states. The assumption was simple. Nothing flies through Soviet airspace unchallenged. But one jet, just one, had disproved that. The F-117's flawless raids destroyed more than bunkers and radar domes. They shattered the credibility of the very system the Soviets had spent generations perfecting. It wasn't just Iraq that had been defeated, it was the blueprint for defending the Soviet Union itself. Internally, Soviet generals struggled to find answers. There was no countermeasure ready, no parallel program in development. The USSR had tested low observable coatings, but none had matured beyond limited prototypes. Their fighter designs, Mi-G 29 seconds, Su 27 seconds, excelled in maneuverability and speed, not evasion. Worse still, the F-117's success wasn't isolated. It was integrated into a broader transformation. The Soviets hadn't fully understood precision warfare, where guided munitions, digital command, and real-time intelligence rendered mass formations obsolete. A single F-117 with a laser-guided bomb could achieve what once took a flight of 22 seconds. A networked air force could dismantle entire air defense regions in a matter of hours. Soviet planners were watching the death of numerical advantage. In Politburo meetings, the reports were unambiguous. If NATO launched a surprise air campaign using stealth and precision systems, large portions of Soviet defenses might never even fire a shot. The psychological toll was immense. Defense Minister Dmitry Yazov reportedly lamented, "We trained to intercept fighters. They've built shadows instead." It wasn't just about losing a tactical edge. It was about losing the strategic confidence that the homeland could be defended. The once ironclad promise that the skies above the Soviet Union were shielded by the best air defense network on Earth was now in question. That doubt spread fast. Warsaw Pact partners began questioning Soviet gear. Intelligence officials worried about a stealth arms race they couldn't win. And within months, the USSR itself was gone, collapsing not just from economic strain, but from the terrifying realization that it had fallen behind militarily in a way it might never recover from. Stealth wasn't just a new kind of plane. It was the death knell for a way of war that had ruled the East for decades. Long after the F-117 completed its final mission, after it was officially retired and its hangars sealed, the shadow it cast over Soviet and later Russian strategy remained. Because the lesson wasn't in the shape of the plane. It was in its silence. Across every Soviet military academy, new generations of air defense officers would study Operation Desert Storm as the turning point when radar supremacy died. Every blank radar screen during the F-117's runs wasn't just a tactical failure, it was a strategic haunting. An invisible warplane that rendered doctrines, divisions, and decades of defense planning utterly obsolete. The Americans hadn't just built a weapon, they had built a ghost. And that ghost changed everything. In the years that followed, Russia poured billions into catching up. Radar-absorbent coatings, over-the-horizon detection, infrared tracking, and multi-band targeting systems were developed to counter stealth, but they were chasing echoes. The original F-117 had already moved on its design lessons, flowing into the B-2 Spirit, the F-22 Raptor, and later, the F-35 Lightning II. Each one stealthier, each one deadlier, each one part of the system the Soviets never truly cracked. Meanwhile, the psychological aftershock lingered. In declassified after-action reports, Soviet officers confessed that the most terrifying part of the F-117 wasn't its speed, payload, or even accuracy. It was the moment of silence before impact when every radar screen went black. Every gun stayed silent, and the ground beneath command bunkers exploded without warning. The USSR had always prepared for loud wars. Massed tanks, screeching fighters, thousands of boots marching. But what they faced instead was a new kind of war. A quiet one. A war where you lose before you know it started. Today, the legacy of the F-117 remains enshrined, not in museums, but in the very shape of modern warfare. Precision, low observability, information dominance. Everything that came after drones, electronic warfare, cyber operations, flows from the same principle: win by disappearing. The Cold War ended not with a nuclear flash, but with a whisper in the night sky. The F-117 was never seen, only felt, and the empire it shattered never recovered.